Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. I'm an author of over 30 published novels and a ninth grade English teacher. And on this week's episode, I will be talking to Lynn Ellen Doxon about her new book, The Moonlight Cavalry, that is out from Artemisia Publishing. So, Lynn, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Okay, I've been writing just about all my life. I started writing poetry and stories in second grade and worked for the Cooperative Extension Service, where I wrote a lot of the publications that people are still reading about how to grow plants. And now I'm retired and writing novels.
Wonderful. I'm so glad you're able to use your retirement to do something so fun and productive.
Thank you.
Well, let's talk about what this book is, because it's got a really interesting origin, and you bring together quite a few different elements that I want to chat with you about as we go. But first, tell our listeners what the Moonlight Cavalry is about.
It's about a searchlight unit in the anti-aircraft artillery in the Pacific. And I discovered that most of the World War II novels that were written about Europe. But this one is in the Pacific, and it talks about how they jumped from island to island and were fighting the Japanese, not necessarily head-on right at the beginning, because they didn't feel they could handle that, the general. The policy was Europe first, so Europe got most of the best equipment, and the Pacific was sort of a stepchild until the war in Europe was won. The book is based rather loosely on my dad's experience in World War II. He was an anti-aircraft artillery officer, and he was on some of the islands that they visited in this book. And it is it's about Eugene Sinclair. This is the second in the series. The series is called Becoming the Greatest Generation, and it talks about the development of the people who went through the horrors of the war, as well as about the incidents of the war. It's called the Moonlight Cavalry because they called them that because they came to the rescue in the middle of the night. That's when they worked. And it also includes letters from Gene's girlfriend, Sarah Gale, who is the photo interpreter with the Allied Security Force, and who is a WAC, was one of the first WACs to join, and gets posted to China during this novel, so that she is present in at least sort of the same part of the world. She hoped to go to the Southwest Pacific, where Gene was, and didn't get posted there. And some of the things that happen in there are things that my dad didn't and wouldn't have done, but it makes a better story if I add a little. During the time that he's there, Gene gets malaria, and unlike my father, he has hallucinations that go with his malaria. Only some people have hallucinations as a result of malaria. But I include those to take us back to an ancestor of his who fought in the Revolutionary War.
Thank you. So yeah, you bring in kind of all the different storylines and elements that I was interested to talk to you about. The dual timelines where we have Gene in his present time, and then when he gets sick, we get this glimpse of the progression of the Revolutionary War throughout that. And that was a really interesting one because it caught me by surprise when I went to those sections at first. And I was like, wait, what are we doing? So that was fun to realize, we're going to get kind of this comparison almost in a way of how the battles were fought and what that looked like for the soldiers involved in those battles compared to Gene's experience, which I thought was an interesting tactic.
Yes, and when I first started writing this, I was thinking that I would write about my ancestors, and I was going to, at one point I had an idea of starting with Charlemagne and going through all the generations since then, and then I thought I wouldn't live that long. And so I decided to go in the opposite direction. And so this series is about my dad's experience, does include a little bit about my sixth great-grandfather, Arthur Sinclair, and then the next one, I might write about Arthur Sinclair's wife, who was a Boston socialite who married this frontiersman who later became a general in the Revolutionary War.
I can imagine her perspective on all of those events would be very fascinating. Oh, I like that idea. So what made you decide, like you said, this is loosely based on some of your dad's experiences. What made you decide to bring in this earlier timeline when the character Jean is sick with malaria and starts having these hallucinations?
Well, my dad was very interested in his ancestry, and the Arthur Sinclair was one of the most prominent of our ancestors, and so I decided to go ahead and include that because I was thinking about both of them at the same time and how they were related but different.
Well, and I liked that, like I said, the comparison that it brought up. I also found it interesting to see the different strategies employed and how that affected the members of the armed forces in both timelines. And like you mentioned at the beginning, kind of Europe got the best supplies. They got what they needed a little bit more than those in the Pacific theater starting out. And it was interesting, I think, what that brought up for me reading that was that difference between those in charge at the higher levels who were, observing it as a strategy, as little icons or, little physical people on a map that they're, moving around and planning. And
Right.
That's such a different viewpoint than those people who are actually in the midst of it, who are, there when they first leave for the islands. They're like, no, we can't give you that much atabrine to prevent malaria. And they're like, but we're going to be gone longer than that.
That's right.
Some of those arbitrary rules, you're like, no, this doesn't work for this particular situation.
Yes, and that's one thing about this novel. It can't quite be classed as a war novel because in a war novel you watch the progress of the war, and in this book you watch the progress of the people in the war.
Right, and I really liked that focus. Yeah, well, it is very personal. It's a look at the effects on the individual characters that you introduce and
right.
Especially like the strain, the toll it takes on their bodies and their minds. You bring up in several parts. I'm trying to think who the character was.
It does include everything from what at that point they called battle fatigue. Now we call it PTSD. It includes an accident of friendly fire. It includes a lot of the ways that people left the front that were not being shot by the enemy. A lot of disease. In fact, in the Pacific, more people were lost to disease than to the enemy.
Yeah, and that's crazy to think about. That, and it's been the case throughout history with things that you're not prepared for, either because it's not thought of or not understood or known. And I was really struck by that. How many of the soldiers are dealing with non-combat in a physical sense of combat effects that were wearing them down. You had one part where they're giving out the bennies like candy, and they're like, keep taking them, keep taking. And the guy's like, wait. Yeah, and it's like you're like on one side you're like, yeah, okay, like I get why those were freely available, but then not thinking about the long-term effects of being then unable to sleep, unable to focus, starting to get paranoid or just prolonged periods of not being able to sleep, how that affects people. And I think that really personal focus that you had in this story really brought home all the different effects that really pile up in stressful situations. I think there was one line that kind of made me laugh, but also like it was just like not funny, but funny, where Jean had had another attack of malaria and been kind of down and out for 3 days. And they're like, well, stress brings this on,
Yeah.
try to reduce your stress, basically.
Yeah,
it's like,
less stress.
yeah,
Yes.
like, I'm in the middle of a war.
How do I do that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, made me think back to times of when my kids were littler and like I was having some health issues and the doctor's like, we think these are mostly stress related, try to reduce your stress. And I just like stared at him. Yeah, that'd be nice.
Mm-hmm.
But another way that you focused really on the personal side of warfare was through the letters with Jean's girlfriend. And I thought that was a really interesting play back and forth of him reading her letters and at times seeing the things that she was struggling with or had complaints about or was frustrated by. And she doesn't really know fully his situation.
No, she doesn't. And she's complaining about not having showers, and he's out in the middle of the jungle.
Waiting to have her laundry done by someone else.
Done, yes.
And it just kind of made me chuckle a little bit because it's like, we get so involved in our own little bubbles of existence, and it can be really hard to step outside of that and think about, what someone else is going through in that moment. And I found that interesting throughout it where, you're watching Jean and you're in his point of view, and then he'll get this letter and he's a very nice and caring character. But there are those moments where it's like, is she really complaining about that? And it would be hard not to be frustrated by that of like, you didn't have enough, makeup or whatever.
Yeah, makeup ran out. Oh no. and then there's also another issue there where she grew up in the backwoods in North Carolina. She's gotten educated since then, but she's always just run around with her brothers. She had 5 brothers. And so she starts doing things with other Army or other military personnel, like tennis lessons and things, and it has no concept. She's so naive about what he might think of that when she writes about it.
Well, yeah, and again, just kind of that individual perspective of where each person comes from and how much that affects your path forward and your decisions moving forward, and seeing that with her and the other members of Jean's unit as well at times where you highlight some of the cultural differences. They're there with some of the Australians at times. And I thought that was a fun added layer to see when so many people from so many places are put together, where some of those conflicts and misconceptions come in.
Yeah, I tried to show some of that in the Jean being from rural Kansas, and one of the officers he's supervising is from New York City, and they don't get along at all. And then there's the guy from Louisiana versus the guy from Texas, and they actually lived quite close to each other and both worked in radio, so they both think their own radio stations are the best. And but so I tried to put some of those things about how the people from different parts of the United States as well as people from other countries in the United States get along.
That's still something, today, even with how much more in contact and globally aware, and, you can find any sort of information about anything on the internet, we're still struggling with that in so many ways as cultures and as people, of understanding other perspectives and respecting other people's beliefs and traditions and ideas. And it fascinates me reading something historical like this and seeing some of those conflicts come up, and this being however many years later, and you're like, still not any better at it.
Yes. Uh-huh.
You hope we're learning overall to do a little bit better about that, but it is interesting with anything historical to see some of those same themes and comparisons in your world in the present time. And I think it makes you think about, especially with this one, reasons for war. What are some of those aspects that come in that are influencing the decisions being made? How do people work together in high stress situations? And how do we deal with each other on a global scale and see where some of those changes have occurred and where they haven't, or where they've gone backwards, I think, in some situations.
Right. So there are some things that have changed for the worse rather than for the better. And then right at the end of the book, towards the end, not at the very end, but towards the end, Gene gets put in charge of a temporary prisoner of war camp, and starts to realize that the Japanese aren't the heathen, heartless fighters that he thought they were. And that's the beginning of where it goes into the next book, where he is part of the occupation force of Japan and gets to know the Japanese as a people rather than just as an enemy.
And that's, I think, probably not an easy thing to switch that mindset. I think that will be really interesting to read and explore that and see that through this character's eyes. I think there's still those tensions for people, whether we don't have a lot of World War II survivors still around and talking about their experiences, but I think even with some of the more recent conflicts, that's not an easy thing to go through these stressful, traumatizing experiences, and then when it ends, when it moves on to a different phase of something, to switch gears and just be like, okay, well now we're helping. Now we're, supposed to get along and be friends. And it's like, oh man, that's really tough. So I'm really interested to see how Gene handles that moving forward in the next book.
I'm still working on that one, and it's the hardest yet.
I can imagine, yeah, because you really, when you're writing those characters, you really have to get into their minds and hearts and try to see the world through their perspective. And yeah, that's a challenging one. I did want to ask you as well about your research for these, because not only are you researching the Pacific Theater and the events that happened during that time, you've got the Revolutionary War aspects coming in, and then you've got the letters back and forth, and she can't say a lot about what she's doing.
Yes, right.
But yeah, you've got
at it.
Right. She's doing secret classified work, and but that's a lot of different aspects to research. So how did you approach that and collect everything?
I spent more time on research than anything else. And I would think I had it down, and then I would get into something and I would say, I'm not real sure whether this would have been that way. And so I would be in the middle of writing the third draft, and I'd go back and re-research something. I'm very thankful for the internet, because it's amazing what you can find on the internet. A lot of the facts about the searchlight units I found in publications that are now unclassified about what really did happen. They had facts and figures and places and names and all sorts of things in those. And then there's a very useful timeline in case I ever tried to change the whole timeline of the war. I can always go check back on that.
That's good.
And then there were some things, a few of the things. My father very seldom talked about his experiences in the war, but there are some things that really did happen. And one thing that he did talk about was being stranded on an island with nothing to eat but tuna, as the tuna got more and more rancid. So and he never ate tuna.
I imagine not. Oh, yeah, I was going to ask you that. Did he ever eat it again?
He would not eat tuna. So I included that. I put that in there as one of the incidents that happened. And He did say he went behind enemy lines at one point, spying on them, and I didn't. I put in a story behind enemy lines that was, I think, much more adventurous than what he did, but I did get him behind enemy lines once.
Well, and how did you go about kind of making decisions on what you were going to keep true to history and where you were going to add or invent, create additional elements? I mean, it sounds like obviously like you kept the events of the war as is, because that would throw people off if they were familiar with that. I mean, like, wait, that didn't happen then.
Yeah.
But yeah, how did you blend those two things?
Well, I had to get him to the Pacific earlier than my dad actually went to the Pacific because I just couldn't spend that much time training troops in the United States. It would be a boring story. So a big part of it was how to make the story more interesting. And another part of it was trying to include the spirit of things that happened, like the relationship between the Australians and the Americans, and like the fear and the fact that the army didn't always know what they were doing at the beginning because they had most of the people who were leading the fight had not experienced actual combat before. MacArthur had, but he was he's much older than most of the generals that he worked with, that worked under him. And so I looked up the personalities of the generals as well as the personalities of making character analysis of the fictional characters I had in there. I looked up the actual personalities of some generals and other people who they would have run into, and tried to make that accurate. And then I did what I thought the fictional characters' reactions to those things would be. I kind of made up.
Well, it's interesting that you were able to get enough information at this point in time to be able to look at those real personalities and some of those decisions and interactions that were available. Because like you said, a lot of that remained classified for quite a long time. I'm trying to remember, is it like 60 or 70 years? I can't remember when that point is hit.
A lot of it was at 70 years, which is why I suddenly was able to do this, as opposed to not having anything available before that.
Well, and that's just such a fascinating thing. I've read a handful over the past while of World War II related stories, whether fiction or nonfiction. I just finished listening to The Zookeeper's Wife, which was fascinating. It was more in Warsaw, Poland, and what was happening there during World War II. And it's so interesting to see, as these documents have become declassified, how many more stories we're seeing and how much more information is available to really increase the public understanding of what was going on during these conflicts, that so many people did so many really incredible things that they couldn't talk about, even, for the majority of their lives. Like, they still were under those edicts of, this is classified, you don't discuss this with anyone. And what that must have felt like for some of those military personnel to have been on these missions or done these things and not being able to talk about it to anyone.
Right. Mm-hmm. And living in Albuquerque, you run into a lot of that because there are a lot of engineers and people in Albuquerque who were in Los Alamos, and they couldn't talk about it until very recently, and most of them died before they could. And most of that generation, most of the men at least of that generation, did do things that they couldn't talk about.
And I was thinking, how much that compounds, because a lot of people in that generation, were not encouraged to talk about their experiences just in general, especially, the negative mental and emotional effects that took place. And how difficult that is for our soldiers to not be able to talk about their day-to-day experiences and then not feeling like they can talk about the impacts that those experiences had on them. And
Right.
like, man, it's really no wonder why so many struggled in the years after coming home. There wasn't that
Yeah, they were
support
just supposed
available.
to. Yeah, they were just supposed to come home and go back to life, life as it
Yeah.
was before. Except it was the Depression before, so not exactly like it was before, but the new life of the 50s is what they were supposed to come back to.
Yeah.
And one thing I learned in doing the research, I was born in the early 50s, and I thought that immediately that I didn't think in terms of the transition period between the war and the time that I can remember. But I've learned in this research that I've done that was more difficult than I thought it was. To have that, when the men came home, the women were put out of the jobs that they had, and the men. And I knew in my mind that happened because my mother worked as a butcher during the war, and as soon as the men came home, she was out of that job and became a bookkeeper at a hardware store. So she could do a woman's job, not a
Yeah.
man's job.
Yeah, definitely a time of a lot of social and cultural and economic change in those years that
Yes.
probably nobody really knew how to navigate.
I don't think they did, but they did the best they could because they'd just gone through 5 years of not knowing how to navigate, so they just kept at it and figured it out.
True, which I think is where your series title comes in, seeing what this generation of people, got through, survived, and moved forward in the best way that they know how. And I think it's an era where you do get so many interesting, fascinating stories that I think we can learn a lot from even today.
Right, right. If we can find the stories now. And there are some recorded stories of people talking about it, and there are some people, like my mother, who's still alive and can tell them when she remembers them. And
Well, it's
so,
wonderful that there are efforts to preserve and record those stories so we can continue to have them
right.
and learn from them. And I just looked at our time, and we are already to the point where we need to start wrapping up. So it's a
Yeah.
wonderful conversation. And I did want to remind our listeners that the book is called The Moonlight Cavalry by Lynn and Doxon. And Lynn, where can people find you online and stay up to date on when the next book is going to come out?
It's available on the book's available on Amazon. Both first and second volumes are there. And I have a website that is just lynndoxon.com.
Wonderful. Nice and easy to find you. That's always helpful. Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Lynn, for taking the time to talk today. I really enjoyed the chance to read your story inspired by your father's life and all the other aspects that you were able to bring into that to show that personal side of what was going on during that time and how these soldiers experienced World War II. Appreciate you taking the time and the opportunity to read.
Okay, thank you.